Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership interview series. I could not be more thrilled today to be joined by Jayne Hrdlicka. Jayne, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Melissa. Happy to be here.
Brilliant. So, for those people that haven't come across you before, Jayne, I don't think it will be many, but let me just share that Jayne's been the CEO of the Virgin Australia Group since late 2020 and has over 20 years leadership experience in the consumer, industrial, and aviation sectors. Jayne's held various leadership roles at the Qantas Group for over a decade, was instrumental in the design of Qantas Loyalty Program, Chief Executive Officer of Qantas Loyalty and Digital Ventures, as well as the CEO of the Jetstar Group, and I'll share a story about that in a minute, but also serves as the Chair of Tennis Australia. So Jayne, you're joining us at the completion of another successful Australian Open with a little bit of Australian Open jet lag, I hear.
Well, that's true. That's true. January is one of the most extraordinary months in Melbourne, and largely because of the Australian Open. And just really proud. Every year we're going to new heights, and this year we've grown attendance levels on site by 10%, and revenue will grow by significantly more than that. And we have more people attending our Grand Slam than Wimbledon, Roland Garros, or the US Open, and more people watching from home, which is pretty extraordinary given that we're anchored in little Australia compared to North America and Europe. So
Absolutely.
we have a lot to be proud of, and but it does take a little time on the other side just to get both feet back on the ground and sleep at normal times.
Well, thank you for joining us in all of that. And I said I would circle back briefly to your time as the Jetstar CEO. And, I was laughing to myself this morning, remembering we first met when we were both CEOs. You were a client CEO of mine. And our first meeting was as a result of one of my team stuffing up and your team ending up in the newspaper headlines. It was a great way to meet.
Also a really important part of my journey as a CEO. Just another one of those examples where you really have to roll up the sleeves and get into the detail. And I mean, all the way down to
Yeah.
how on earth did this happen, which was, fault on your side, but also fault on ours because we were motivating your team to do all the wrong things. And the way we'd structured a contract, didn't actually drive the outcomes that we needed to achieve in balance. And so, yeah, you've got to be able to get into the detail and get all the way down into the gory things that you don't want to know, but you need to know.
You need
And
to know.
everybody around you needs to see you doing that. And you also need to be sitting at 40,000 feet, clear about the strategic issues and challenges and making sure that you have a very clear plan for the future and where you're headed.
So we're going to get an opportunity today to kind of work our way through your career and motivations and all sorts of different things. And I'm particularly interested in people having an opportunity as we reflect on maybe your early stage as, a first-time CEO as well. There's lots of time to do more than that. But can we go right back? And Jayne, for the people that haven't had the pleasure of coming across you before, just tell us, who are you? Who is
Huh.
Jayne Hrdlicka?
Um, well, look, I guess I'm a mix of things, right? I'm a very outcome-oriented person, very active person. I'm a mother of two boys and a proud owner of three dogs. I would consider myself, a dog mom. So I have a busy household, one child in the US playing tennis in college and one about to embark on year 12. And so, and I'm very focused on my career as well as being very focused on my role as a mom. And so, yeah, I have a huge passion for life and huge passion for living life to its fullest, both from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint. And I get asked regularly, how on earth do you do all the things that you do? And my answer is a short one, which is ruthless prioritization.
Yeah.
I'm super clear about what matters most in the pathway to delivering great outcomes in both my jobs as chair of Tennis Australia and CEO of Virgin. And I'm also super clear about what it takes for me to be a great mom and what my kids need from me, over a period of time and in moments. And that means I can make the right trade-offs between the things that matter most to me.
I love that.
Then the only challenge is that as human beings ourselves, we have needs, and they tend to get, for working moms, they tend to go down to the very bottom of the list. And so from time to time, I have to pull myself up and recognize that I just need to take a break or need to do something for myself because we tend to be relatively selfless.
Yeah. So we'll get back around to that because I do want to ask about it. But you don't have a traditional Australian accent. So can we go way back? I mean, how did you end up here? What did you imagine you were going to be doing when you left school?
Well, look, that's such a long time ago, sadly. But the picture for me is I grew up in the state of Kansas in the US, and I grew up in an unusual household because my father was European, had grown up in the Czech Republic, and defected as an athlete at the age of 16 when he had an opportunity traveling for the national hockey team, ice hockey team. They were playing in Paris, and he had a moment where he had his passport and he could run, and he did. And the year before, he'd met some Boy Scouts between the Germans and the Russians occupying what was in Czechoslovakia. And he'd met these Boy Scouts, and he wrote them a letter and said, here are my circumstances. Can you help me get to the US? And so they did. And they raised money for him and flew him to Wichita, Kansas.
Wow.
And so that's how he landed in Kansas. Then he meets my mom, who grew up in Kansas, on a farm, big ranch family. And so her family were very, successful agricultural entrepreneurs, really. And then my father had this really interesting background. And so I had a work hard ethic in my family. And I grew up in a place where people said what they meant and did what they said, which
Yeah.
was, I think, a great place to grow up. Like no BS, no games getting played.
Mhm.
The focus was doing a great job, working hard and doing a great job and delivering great results as a consequence. And so that's the environment that I grew up in. And I also grew up in an environment where, I was encouraged to push myself to be the very best that I could be and to dream big dreams.
Mhm.
And so I never at any point in my childhood thought that there would be limits on what I could do. And I think that was super helpful, right? Because I've never thought that there would be limits on what I could do. And turns out it can be harder as a woman to achieve your dreams. But you can't really think about that or worry about that. You just have to focus on doing a great job and making sure that you're working with people who recognize talent and want to invest behind talent. And if you're doing those two things, then ultimately you get opportunities to do unusual things and give yourself the pathway to be the best version of yourself and make a difference.
So where did you then went to college? What did how did the early career kick off?
So I went to university in the US, and I chose a academically selective school in Colorado, a place called Colorado College, which was awesome for me because it was about probably 2,500 students, and they were from all over the country. At that point, not all over the world, but all over the country. And so, a little girl from Kansas goes into school with, my best friends were from, New York City and San Francisco, really. And so that was a great first step. And you're learning to see the world through other people's eyes and working hard and doing a great job in school. And then I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and then I started to actually understand what that meant and what life as a lawyer would look like. My father was a lawyer, so that was probably what influenced me.
Mm.
And then decided I didn't want to be a lawyer once I really stared into what that job meant. And then decided I wanted to go to business school, and then realized that it was going to be very difficult to get into business school straight out of college. But I gave it a crack anyway. I was told there was no chance, but I gave it a crack because I'd done lots of part-time jobs and things. I figured, why not give it a try?
Yeah.
And I got in. I got into two schools, Dartmouth's business school and Northwestern's business school. So the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth and Kellogg at Northwestern. But it was contingent upon getting 2 years of work experience.
Right.
So I feel like I'd won, the lottery because I was told it was impossible and I got it done. And then I had the opportunity to go choose a job on the basis of where I was going to learn the most.
Mm.
And because it was a job for 2 years before then going to business school. And I ended up having this unique opportunity to go and work for what's now Ernst & Young, but was then Arthur Young, and a new business that they were creating to support up and coming high growth businesses. And they called it the Entrepreneurial Services Group. And so I was one of 5 people to build this business, which is now a big global practice for them.
Amazing.
And that meant I got to, I mean, I didn't know how to use a spreadsheet at that point, right? So I had to teach myself a lot on the job, and became a consultant, supporting small businesses that had huge opportunity. And some of those CEOs are still friends of mine. And the guy who started the practice is still a good friend of mine, a guy who, keeps in touch with me from time to time, checking in on how things are going. And then that created the perfect set of experiences for me going into business school. And because I stepped back from it when I was elated about getting into business school without having to do 4 or 5 years worth of work. And then I realized I need a job that's going to enable me to get 4 or 5 years worth of experience in 2, because I didn't want to waste any time. I was definitely going to go start business school after 2 years of work experience, but I knew I was going to be one of the youngest and least experienced.
Mm.
And so when I started business school, I was one of the youngest and one of the least experienced on paper. But in practice, I'd worked so hard in my 2 years, and I'd learned a lot, because the spectrum of different industries and problems and things that I'd had exposure to was big. And because the businesses were small and high growth, I got to do a whole lot more than I would if they were really big companies. And so I was able to get my arms around what it took to make those businesses successful and what drove outcomes.
Mm.
That helped me a lot then when I started in business school. And then I had 2 years in business school thinking that I would be sorting out what I wanted to do with my life. And what I wanted to be when I grew up, from a career standpoint.
Absolutely.
And within the first 2 weeks, I was having to write my resume for summer recruiting, and your summer job was going to dictate what sort of job you got after your 2 years. And so, and your resume had to be designed for the sort of job that you wanted.
Right.
So like this, my bubble got popped very quickly. I didn't have 2 years to figure out what I wanted
What
to
I
do.
wanted to do. Yeah.
And so I landed on, I wanted to go into either consulting or investment banking, because both of those would give me broader exposure, and they'd sort of be my post-grad study, in effect, by giving me lots of options to really learn and figure out what I really did want to do ultimately when I grew up. And I had opportunities to go into both investment banking and consulting, and ultimately went to work for Bain and Company in Boston. And I knew straight away when I had my interview with them that that is what I wanted to do, because of the people. The cultural fit was just really good for me. And I look back and think how fortunate I am. Man, maybe it comes from my roots in Kansas, I don't know, but I figured out very quickly that who you're working with is as important as what you're working on, if not.
Absolutely.
And the fact that when I went to work for this little startup within a big accounting firm in Kansas City, the partner that I was working with took me under his wing and still checks in on me today. And that sort of focus, and like I had an opportunity to go to work in Manhattan, and for the little girl from Kansas to go work in Manhattan, that was pretty appealing. But it was a much bigger investment management fund.
Yeah.
I just didn't feel like I was going to learn as much, and I didn't feel the same connection to the managing partner. And so I started making decisions on the basis of the people that I would be working with early. And I'm grateful for that, because for sure, that enabled me to, get opportunities that opened up for me that, maybe otherwise wouldn't have, or would have taken a lot longer. And so I really encourage, young women today, make sure that you are working with people who you feel that you'll get great mentorship from.
Absolutely.
And you'll be in an environment that is, talent hungry, looking for people who are making a difference.
Yeah.
And if you're doing those things, then you're putting yourself in a position to get access to the best opportunities, and to explore, the things that you're able to do ultimately.
Same story. I mean, I remember when I got approached to go and join a startup where I ended up becoming CEO. I knew one person, great mentor, really enjoyed my time with him. And when he said, "Do you want to join?" I mean, it was tiny business and risky and all sorts of things. And I said, "I want to meet the CEO." Met the CEO and clicked, and I thought I can learn. And I'm so agree with what you're saying there. So, Bain, you were with Bain for quite a while then, weren't you?
Yeah, so I worked for Bain& Company in Boston for about 3.5 years or so.
Mm.
And then the consulting firm was actually having quite a lot of strife and difficulty, and I thought it was going to break up into two pieces. And one of the partners that I had a lot of time and respect for was one of the most senior partners. He left to go start his own consulting firm, and I left and went to work for him in his first client. And so ended up having my first sort of executive job in an environment where I got to meet the CEO through my former partner, who was also going to be doing work for that company. And so it was a really nice way to kind of get started. And it was a smaller business. It was about 500 million in turnover. Yeah, 500 million in turnover, private equity owned, one of the first private equity funds in the US, guy named Bennett LeBeau owned it. And it was just a fantastic experience. And I started out as the head of strategy and transformation. And then within about 6 months, ended up being the chief operating officer responsible for navigating a massive transformation of the operating function. And, I'd managed three people in my experience at being a company. And all of a sudden, I've got, I don't know what it was, 1,500 people that I'm responsible for. And, many of whom I was going to have to make redundant. And so I cut my teeth in that experience in what it takes to make money and how important it is to fix broken parts of a business and fix them quickly and with no regrets. Have a strategy, have a game plan, and then execute with massive discipline and into the detail so that you can support people through doing really difficult things.
Mm.
And that was a big success, and then led to an opportunity to come to Australia to run a business as a CEO that was also a very small business with an entrepreneur that had built this business, and it was exactly the same sort of strife. So I did that for about 3 years and helped him fix that and get his equity out of it. And then went back to Bain& Company to kind of get back to the top end of town, having figured out how to make money.
Mm.
And I had such an easy time. I came back into Bain& Company and was a partner within a year and had just fantastic experiences working with amazing CEOs in a variety of different contexts. And I understood their challenges in a way that most of my colleagues did not, because
Wouldn't.
I'm into consulting and they'd stayed in consulting. I
Yes.
had 6 years out in two different experiences, very broken businesses, fixing them, getting them into a place where they're making money again. And, and that drew on this mix of skills, both strategy and, sort of operational grit
Mm.
to, really bring the best out of an organization. And I met Rod Eddington. He was my first client, and that was my first experience in aviation. And I met Alan Joyce in that process as well. And that just started a different snowball down the hill. And then when Alan became CEO of Qantas, I started doing some work for Qantas, then ultimately ended up, joining Alan to help deliver against the big agenda that he had.
And launched Jetstar, right?
Alan launched Jetstar. So Alan was the sort of founding CEO of Jetstar.
Yeah, okay.
He'd done that before being appointed CEO of
Okay.
Qantas Group. And so I was the third CEO,
Okay.
Jetstar, and really loved that experience. Like, it was such a hard job, and I'd never run any part of an airline before, right? And the Jetstar Group is an airline in Australia, an airline in New Zealand, an airline in Singapore, and at that time it was an airline in Vietnam and also an airline in Japan. And we were starting a new one, trying to start a new one in Hong Kong. So it was 6 airlines, not one. And I hadn't run any bit of one.
One.
So I would say drinking from the fire hose is, an apt expression for what my first 18 months really looked like, because I had so much to learn and was grateful for having an incredibly talented team.
Mm,
But we had a lot of work to do, and it was a tough period in aviation where airlines weren't making money. And so we had a lot to do to get ourselves in a position where we could be very profitable again.
mm,
And we subsequently were. But it also meant that I had to get really good at running airlines in Asia. And so I learned a lot about the region and learned a lot about being a minority investor in joint ventures in Asia,
mhm,
where you're actually the operating partner and running those airlines, but on behalf of all shareholders. And so I was just, it was fascinating learning how to do business and get good outcomes in Vietnam, learning how to do business and get good outcomes in Singapore, learning how to do business and get good outcomes in Japan and in mainland China and in Hong Kong, working with state-owned enterprise in China. It was fascinating and so challenging because you really do have to go back to first principles and learn cultures in order to figure out how to get outcomes. Because, there's one way of doing things that works very effectively in Australia, but that's not the same approach that's going to be as effective in Singapore, Vietnam, Japan, and China. And
mm.
so, and building relationships is different, and the basis on which you do that is different. And yeah, so I've just found it to be a fascinating experience. And it really helped me um, hone my skills being a strategist and understanding how to think about opportunity and the unique place that we can go as a business, but also having the ability to get down into huge amounts of detail with anybody, no matter what the technical issue,
Mm,
just by asking good questions. And and you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to stay at 40,000 feet and you have to be able to go down to one
mm,
in order to be, in my experience, in order to be a successful CEO, in order to ensure that everybody understands the importance of driving to outcomes, and to ensure that you've got enough intuition about the issues and risks and challenges in the business that you can help the organization steer clear of those issues and challenges while delivering the straightest path to success.
Jayne, I'd love to ask you, often I'll ask people, when did it first come on your radar that you could become CEO? And I'd answer that for me first.
Oh, look, I thought that and had ambition for that when I was in business school.
Yeah.
Um, and because I'd already spent enough time, I had 2 years spending time with CEOs of smaller businesses, and
Mm,
I was fascinated by the level of responsibility and the need to be good at a lot of things.
mm,
And it just looked like a ton of fun. Um, and because ultimately your biggest job as a CEO is to make sure there's a great strategy and then make sure you've got an amazing team, very diverse mix of people who have the combination of skills to execute that strategy. And then you're the conductor of the orchestra, and you need to bring the best out in everybody and have the ability to coach and develop and assist where assistance is needed when there's heavy lifting to be done. And so you've got to be prepared to roll up the sleeves and have a team around you who also know how to roll up the sleeves and get into it, who are all incredibly outcome oriented.
Can
And
I ask,
important.
so I'm going to jump in there for a minute. Your first CEO role then, in the US before you came out here, and it's interesting for me because I wonder whether this reflection will be first time you became a CEO or first time you made that leap from leading 3 people to 1,500 people.
Yeah.
My feeling from most of the CEOs and recalling my own experience as a CEO is when you sit in that seat and when you get that title for the first time, it's a it's really interesting. People look at you differently. Like it's a very different. I just wonder if you recall that. Like, do you recall anything about that early phase in that first role about what might have surprised you about the role or
Well, for sure, the first big taste of that was when I became the chief operating officer in this business in the US.
Mm.
And because I was responsible for making a whole bunch of decisions that were going to affect the future of all employees.
Yeah.
Because if we didn't fix the operation, the rest of the business didn't exist.
Mm.
And that was where all the issues and challenges were, because we were producing product at a price that we couldn't sell the product for.
Mhm.
And so we had to figure out how to deliver the quality at a much lower price point, and there were a whole lot of aspects that were tricky in making that true. And so I just felt massive responsibility, and I had a whole bunch of people's jobs in my hands effectively. And I didn't sleep a lot for the first 6 months because it was just such a huge responsibility. And so that's when it probably first dawned on me, because you have such a broad spectrum of things that are coming at you, and the people issues and challenges are quite unique. Um, because in most businesses you have a very big spectrum of people, all of whom are critical to the success of your business, but they all have different backgrounds and different levels of skill and expertise and education. And
Mm.
so how you motivate that spectrum of people is different by work group, and you have to be good at it all. And so that was probably the beginning of it. And then when I became the CEO of a much smaller business in Australia, then that was the next level up, because that was trying to save a business from going into administration. And
Mm.
so I was working with the banks and cutting, good deals with our suppliers, trying to get an earn out of the payables that we, weren't able to honor, and serious cash crisis that, needed to be averted while also running the business.
Mm.
So you get a sense of the awesome responsibility that's end to end, and the spectrum of internal and external people is just much broader. And so that was super helpful. But it is an awesome set of responsibilities, and that's how it felt to me, was the responsibility. And I literally didn't, for the first 6 months with that sort of responsibility, didn't sleep much, because we were in crisis stage, and I knew how many people's jobs and livelihoods were on my shoulders. And if we didn't get it right, it was going to be down to me not leading people well through the opportunity, because the opportunity was well defined.
You've had a lot of different CEO opportunities now, right? And so you've had a number where you've gone in and you're trying to effect a turnaround, a rescue, whatever it is. And then other examples where that might not necessarily be the case. But in every situation you go in, and I know that you can look around and see that there are millions of things that need to be addressed and fixed, right? When we come in, how do you quickly work out? You talked about ruthless prioritization earlier. How do you work out where to start?
To me, that's about strategy, understanding where you're trying to get to,
Mm.
and then what has to be true in order for you to be able to get there. And once you understand where you're trying to go, you understand what has to be different in order to get there. Then you can work through, okay, what needs to happen first, second, and third in order to give us the best possible chance of getting to that outcome. And and I'm a very impatient person, and I also believe that if you really stretch people, you get way more out of them than if you try to conservatively plan what's achievable. And so I'm a little bit famous inside Virgin for people going, "What? There's no way we're going to be able to get all that done." And we get about 95% of it done. And the alternative was doing about 80% of it. And that was the key to us, being in a position when the border started to relax and people were flying again, to be able to really serve Australia well,
Mm.
and to be able to make money doing it. And so to me, ruthless prioritization comes down to clarity on what matters. And clarity on what matters comes from clarity on where you're headed and what has to be true in order for you to be able to get there.
Mm.
And then being able to work out, okay, what are the combination of things that need to happen, and in what order, in order to most quickly and effectively get there, managing the risk.
I want to ask you because I own being impatient as well, and there are some fantastic qualities to being impatient as a leader. There's some that can be challenging as well. Have you had to face any of those, or what do you think there are challenges with being impatient as a leader?
Oh, for sure, because people will just every now and then lose it, because
Yeah.
they feel like there's just too much happening and they can't do it all. And so, but I think that's also a good thing because it helps everybody, and it's important for me to step in and go, no, you can, and here's how you can, and help them break it down so it's not overwhelming.
Mm,
And so it's also part of the teaching opportunity, because I can naturally do it myself, that's a learned skill over a lot of years, and I probably got a lot better at it once I had kids. um, but helping people learn how to break things down so they don't get overwhelmed over it and can manage their people better and can deliver more, is part of it. And I think, one of the other challenges is that you always have to be mindful of the mix of things that you're trying to do. What pressure is it creating where in the organization? So you can kind of do a heat map
mm,
so that you don't inadvertently completely overstress a part of the business that then has knock-on consequences that undermine all the good things that are being done.
mm,
And so you have to have conscious thought about what's implied, what has to change where, and where the pinch point is going to be in the organization so that you know that there's actually enough capacity, with stretch, to be able to do the mix of things and that you're not actually putting people over the edge. And the other thing I'd say is that for us as a business, us Virgin as a business, during COVID and having gone into administration, the stress on people who had been through that was
mm.
next level. And the other thing I had to recognize was that a big chunk of people in our business had PTSD.
Yeah.
And so we had to think about things a little bit differently. I had to think about things a little bit differently and help people through the PTSD. And we actually got organization psychologists to help us get people through that because it was chewing up capacity.
Mm.
Human capacity was
Absolutely.
lost because people were still traumatized by the combined experiences of COVID and the uncertainty of COVID and the impact that had in our industry, which is big enough trauma on its own. But then we also went into bankruptcy and no clue for a lot of people in terms of whether or not their jobs were stable and we'd get out of it on the other side.
Mm.
And if you don't have the ability to kind of see around corners, it was a really, really anxious experience for people. And so I had to bear that in mind too, and not take us off course and let us, get crippled by it, but you use it as a motivator and recognize it as a problem that needed to be solved.
What do you do yourself? Because as CEOs, we're not immune to, those anxious thoughts and feelings and worries and all sorts of different things. How do you anchor yourself when you feel like that?
We've lost the light in the
You're
room.
spotlighted.
Um, so look, it's easy for me because I do have just a huge capacity to do a lot in
Yeah,
terms of workload.
yeah.
And I've been told I have an incredible work ethic, which I think is probably true. It's easy for me to lose sight of myself in the process, and then I find when that's true, then it's easier to get overwhelmed by things and not to be able to put things in context. And being able to put things in context is the key, not to getting anxious and worried about things. And yeah, and so yeah, so for me, making sure that I've always got enough space myself, and exercise for me is the thing that gives me more capacity to put things in their natural boxes. And
What do you do? You're a tennis player, aren't you? But what do you do?
tennis, running, walking, hiking, going to the gym,
Yeah.
anything with physical movement in it, really. Um, just to get out and distance from the pull and tug of everything that happens during the day. As a working mom, as a professional, as a CEO, you just need to find a way to create a little bit of distance. We all have it.
Yeah.
There are lots of things that come to you to, be solved. And you just need to create some space so that you can put everything in its rightful spot and make sure that you are clear about what the priorities are.
Mm. Can I ask, I worry that in a lot of people don't get good feedback along the way in their careers. And or they get feedback that they don't know, they don't understand, or it's not something meaningful that they can do something with. I just want to know Have you had good feedback in your career? And when I ask this question, is there a piece of feedback that comes to mind that was critical that helped your career grow? You might not have wanted to hear it at the time.
So I'd say yes in terms of feedback, and I feel quite lucky because my first experience in work, I was in a small team and
Yep.
everybody was giving everybody feedback just to make sure that we were getting better every day.
Mm.
Because we were building a business as well as supporting other businesses. And then when I went to Bain& Company, feedback is a regular thing that happens and you get it every 6 months. And it's a really, really helpful and important piece of growing as a professional.
Mm.
And so then when I became an executive, then that became an important thing for me to do with my teams. And, I have this sort of deep-seated passion about making sure that I'm working hard every day to get better, and everybody around me gets the fact that it's okay. Nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
We're, as an organization, not perfect. Fast failing is way better than hanging around trying to make something perfect, which there is no perfect. And so all you're doing is delaying execution because you're worried about whether or not you're going to get it right. And so being afraid of getting it wrong is a bad place to be. And so focusing on getting better every day and accepting the fact that nothing's perfect is super helpful. And so I feel like I've been in environments with great feedback. And I do remember the most confronting bit of feedback that I got because I was on mat leave and I was a partner at Bain. I was probably a 2-year partner at Bain and in Sydney. And I had had a huge year and I knew I'd had a huge year. And so, your compensation in consulting is driven by how big your year was, how many clients you supported, how much impact you had with your clients. And so I knew that was all going to be really good. And I had this feedback session with the managing partner, and it was about 5 minutes on, great job, blah, blah, blah. And then it was, but you're never going to be a successful senior partner because you don't have a network in Australia because you didn't grow up here and you didn't go to private school here and you didn't captain the cricket team. And, so you should I'm just wanting to manage your expectations, lie the ball, not good.
Mm.
But great job. I'm like, well, far out. I'm on mat leave. I did a rock star great job,
Yep.
and you're paying me as if did a rock star great job. So I know I did. And now you're telling me that, it's not going to be easy to
This is
be
it. Yeah, this is it now.
because I've hit my ceiling. I've hit my level. I'm like I just don't buy that. And so I was pretty cranky and it wasn't delivered in, the most encouraging way.
Mm.
Um, and my, late husband was furious. And I think my son would have been like 2 months old at the time or something. So I put on sneakers and went out for a run. And I came back and Jason was still levitating. I'm like, no, this was actually a gift
Mm.
because it's true that I didn't grow up in Australia and I don't have, connections to people that I grew up with and went to school with, etc. And put aside for a moment the comments about, not, being a captain of a sports team that I could never have been the captain of because I'm a woman, not a man.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a fair point, and I'm not investing in building out, my network. And I've got the privilege of working with amazing CEOs and boards because a lot of the work that I was doing was with boards,
Mm.
really good boards, and with amazing, accomplished directors on them who I had a strong affinity towards.
Mm.
So I'm like, all right, I just need to start going and having coffees with people and building a relationship outside the context of the work. And that was just a great thing for me, right? Because I would never, I'm not the sort of person that would reach out to people for the sake of reaching out to people just because I'm trying to climb. Because that just doesn't sit well with me
Yeah.
because I need to be building relationships that are genuine relationships on the basis of we have shared values and we
Absolutely.
have interests that are common. And so that's what I did. And I remember calling Diane Grady, who is the most amazing woman. And we had similar backgrounds because she grew up through McKinsey. But it was like calling somebody on a date. Like I was really uncomfortable about it. And I didn't do that in high school or college or ever. And so I felt very uncomfortable about it, but it actually was a fantastic thing. And you play it forward maybe 5 years, and I was leaving Bain after having been a successful senior partner. Alan Joyce had asked me to go work for him at Qantas, and I had said yes, but nobody knew yet. And James Strong, who was on the board of Qantas, was asking me to go on to the board of Woolies, or to consider going on to the board of Woolies. And I'd had a couple of really good interviews with him. I was going into my final interview for the Woolworths board, and I got a phone call from the headhunter who basically said, congratulations, you have no relevant experience and you've gotten this far and it's pretty incredible. But you just need to know that what they're really looking for is a CEO. And so you should feel like you've just had a huge success here and view this as an opportunity to learn. And, you'll have many more opportunities in the future. Like, wow. Before I even go into the interview, I am told I have no chance to succeed in the interview. And again, thankfully, I had my running shoes underneath my desk because I was in the office and I was maybe 45 minutes from hopping in a car to go have this interview. And I ran 3 times around Chifley, which was where our offices were, and I looked silly, but I don't care. But it got enough oxygen into my brain to separate myself from the emotion of the experience to the clarity that this interview was about whether or not you understand how to make money. And I knew how to make money. And yes, I hadn't been the CEO of a big company in Australia, but I'd been the CEO of smaller businesses and had had the ability to really understand the brass tacks of what it takes to run a business well and to deliver great outcomes. And so I went into the interview very confident and positive, and finished the interview and thought, I couldn't have done any better. And then got a phone call from the headhunter that night and said, congratulations, albeit you had a bit of unfair advantage, you got the gig. And then went on to talk to me about, the process from here. I'm like, hang on, can we just go back? Because you called me this afternoon and told me I had no chance. And now I had an unfair advantage. So help me understand how I went from having no chance to having had an unfair advantage. And she said, well, your network, the quality of your network overrode your likelihood.
Wow.
And I'm like, all right, that's a cheap shot.
Yeah.
But it was funny. The irony in it, is first it was a liability, and now it was a nasty asset. But the reality is that because people knew me, they listened, and what was on paper didn't adequately represent what I had in terms of insight and wisdom. And so I got the role. And it was a really great experience. And it came about as a consequence of the fact that I had listened to the feedback and really taken it to heart both times. And, getting the phone call from the headhunter saying you have no chance really stoked my fire, and gave me clarity on what I needed to anchor towards in the interview.
None of these things have ever stopped you, as I listened to it, Jane, but you referenced earlier that maybe it's harder. Maybe it's harder to get where you want to get sometimes as a female. I often ask why there aren't more female CEOs. Can I get you to kind of combine those two together and just share your thoughts on that?
Look, I actually think we've made huge progress. So the numbers aren't great, but if you look at where the female CEOs are, I mean,
Huge companies.
two airlines, the two biggest airlines in the country, the whole industries today run by women. The grocery sector is entirely run by women.
Yep.
So two industries that serve a huge composite of the community, and they're being run by women. And so I think that's extraordinary. And Telstra, one of our biggest infrastructure businesses in Australia, and one of the most important because it's a vital backbone of communication across the country, is run by Vicky Brady, an amazing woman. And so I think we've made huge progress because it's not just the numbers, it's the quality of the roles and the stature of the roles and the degree of difficulty of the roles. And so I think we've made great progress. Are we done? No, we're far from done. But I think it helps when you've got women in really important, visible, high-profile leadership roles. It helps inspire others in their organizations and outside their organizations. And the number of women that come up to me everywhere I am to say, in my business and outside, the organizations that I'm involved in, Just to talk about how important it is for them to see women in leadership roles and how inspired they are and how motivated they are to push themselves. And it might be cabin crew talking about wanting to be cabin managers, or cabin managers talking about wanting to go to head office roles, or people who are working in our ground handling teams wanting to be pilots. It's just across the board, and people in head office roles wanting to grow. So I just think having role models who are, some level of inspiration to show that it can be done and to show that you can do it and still be who you are
Mm.
is important.
Oh, important.
And I think that's a big piece of it too, and I think it's a shame that, media tends to be fascinated with female CEOs and more prone to, have a crack at beating up on female CEOs. And I get that because it drives clicks, but it isn't helpful because it is discouraging to other young women who think, oh, gee, why do I want to put myself in a position where I get beaten up for no good reason?
Yeah. How do you deal with that when that happens?
You just have to put it in context and say, I know the truth,
Grab
and
your running shoes?
people around me know the truth, put on my running shoes, and just keep distance from it, right? Because it is not who you are.
Mm. We could talk for such a long time. I mean, there's probably two things. One thing I'll ask quickly before the final question, and it's terrible to breeze over it because it's so important. Strategy, but then aligning your team and making sure the entire team understand where you're going. How do you do that?
It is the most important thing, Melissa. And I'll just go back to my experience coming into Virgin Australia. And, I started work with Bain Capital in April of 2020. So I'm nearly 5 years.
Mm.
And what we were doing when we were going through diligence was figuring out strategy. What is the right place to play for Virgin Australia where it can compete sustainably over time? And that was the anchor for the deal thesis, right? Because if you can't get that right, then nothing else really matters. You can fiddle with the math when you go through administration and temporarily reduce costs, but you have to be in a position where you're creating a sustainable position for the future if you're going to put a bunch of money into it for the long term. And so we had really thought about it and done a lot of consumer research, primary research, and done the math. And then when they asked me to be CEO and there was a change of leadership and it wasn't the original plan, but when they asked me to step in, I said, great. And they said, okay, everybody's really hungry for leadership and clarity on where we're headed. And I said, yep, but I'm not going in with a strategy. We're going to create it together.
Mm.
And they're like, but we have the strategy. Yeah, we have the strategy, but it's not a strategy that is owned by the organization until the organization creates it. So we need to create it together. And so that's what we did. And while I had a very strong hypothesis and it was backed up by a bunch of data, we needed to go through it together as a team, as a leadership team. And then we needed to go through it with the next layer down so that we all owned it, so that we were all clear together, here's where we're headed. And then together, we all define what are the things that we have to do in order to deliver that.
Mm.
And it was a really, really long list, a much longer list than we had come up with during diligence.
Yeah.
And the priorities actually were a little bit different. What had to be done while we were in administration was clear and didn't change, but what had to happen on the other side of that to really bring our business into its own, well, that was driven by what we thought as a business. And I went out and spent 2 weeks with our frontline teams asking them too,
Yeah.
because we needed their input and wisdom in order to ensure that we had the right level of meat on the bones.
Mm.
And while the high level direction didn't change, the substance around it and the richness around what needed to happen first, second, and third, well, that all got refined based on the wisdom of the people in the organization.
Mm.
And so we all collectively owned it. And every step of the way, we stepped back and rethought values, behaviors, what are all the things that need to sit around our strategy to enable us to execute our strategy. We did that together as a team. We, workshopped that broadly throughout the organization so that everybody in the organization understood where we were headed,
Mm.
how what they did every day had a role to play in getting us there.
Yeah.
And when we embarked on transformation initiatives, and we're still in the middle of them, I think we'll never be done making changes for the better for the business. And for people, as we go through all those things, everybody knows, what their role is in driving those initiatives and who has to be involved and what parts of the business we need to be really thoughtful about change management. And like the human side of a business is the most determining side of your ability to be successful. And so it's about people. Yeah, you got to have the right strategy, you got to have the right plans. But at the end of the day, running a successful business is about having the right people and then having the ability to motivate people and lead people to deliver things that are, tough to do in impossibly short timeframes. And that's the fun in it. That's the fun in it. I mean, the human side of business is the fun in it. And getting the energy up and getting people passionate about doing great things, that's the fun.
Sounds like, and I could use probably a million adjectives here, but I'll just use a couple back that you've shared today. But sounds like a dream sort of gig for an impatient little girl from Kansas to to jump into and have some fun. So, Jayne, it's just been an absolute pleasure having the chance to talk with you. I ask every person that I speak to, given the name of the podcast, I just ask, what does brave feminine leadership mean to you? And do you think it needs to change?
Look, I think to me, brave feminine leadership is about staying true to yourself and pursuing a journey of leadership. And you do have to be brave and courageous and a bit fearless in the way that you do that. But staying true to yourself and making sure that when you have the opportunity, you're also looking for ways to help others in their journey, to me is important. And how I define brave feminine leadership for me today is feeling really comfortable, in fashion, feeling very comfortable, in all sorts of public forums and arenas, feeling really comfortable talking about the importance of diversity. We wouldn't be in the position we are in as a business today at Virgin Australia if we didn't have a really diverse mix of people sitting around the table solving some of the toughest problems you could ever have to stare into as a business. And, I think that is just essential. And so staying true to who you are, being very comfortable expressing yourself and very confident leading through all sorts of circumstances and building amazing diverse teams behind you and helping others behind you be the best version of themselves and creating a pathway for other women in the process is important.
Thank you for adding your voice to the conversation. So generous of you. And I know that people will take so much out of the conversation, Jayne. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine, Melissa. These are important and fun conversations to have.